The Invincible Universe had always lived under a quiet, unspoken dread. On the surface, Earth appeared calm. Cities glittered beneath the stars. Heroes patrolled the skies. Politicians spoke of stability, of alliances, of a future built on cooperation between species. Yet beneath all of it, a shadow stretched further with every passing year. The Viltrum Empire was still coming. It had not forgotten this small blue world, and everyone who understood the truth carried that knowledge like a stone hidden inside the chest. The Global Defense Agency prepared in silence. The guardians of the globe trained without rest. Mark Grayson tried to live a normal life while knowing deep down that normal was a costume he was borrowing from a version of himself that no longer existed. Then, on a night that no one would ever forget, the sky itself cracked open. It began as a low vibration in the atmosphere. Satellites lost signal. Aircraft rerouted. Coastal cities reported an eerie stillness in the wind, as though the world had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. High above the Pacific Ocean, a wound appeared in reality. It was not lightning. It was not a meteor. It was a dimensional storm, spiraling with colors that human eyes were never meant to interpret, tearing through the upper atmosphere with the patience of something ancient. Then it dropped its cargo. A single shape plummeted through the storm, wrapped in fire, wreathed in pressure waves that shattered the sound barrier again and again. When it struck the Pacific, the ocean answered with terror. Tsunamis rolled outward in every direction, hammering coastlines from Japan to California. Islands watched black walls of water rise against their shores. Ships were tossed like scraps of paper. The Global Defense Agency scrambled its entire early warning network within seconds, convinced that a rogue asteroid had slipped past every satellite in orbit. They were wrong. When the first reconnaissance craft reached the impact zone, its pilots expected debris, steam, and ruin. Instead, they found the ocean itself hollowed out, forced back into a perfect circular crater by an unseen pressure. And at the very bottom of that crater, standing on scorched seabed as though gravity was a suggestion he had chosen to ignore, was a man. Not a hero. Not a monster in any shape their databases recognized. A giant of a figure, calm, unbothered, gazing up at the strange sky of this new world with something like disappointment slowly turning into curiosity. Horns crowned his head. Tattoos crawled across his skin like old scriptures. A heavy club rested against one shoulder as though it weighed nothing at all. Kaido. Torn from his own world by a collapse he did not understand, the strongest creature of the seas had washed ashore in a universe with no pirates, no emperors, and no devil fruits. For a long moment he simply breathed, testing the air, tasting the difference in the world around him. There were no familiar oars here. No marine, no Yanko, no sea king singing in the deep. And yet as his senses stretched outward, he felt something else entirely. Strange warriors. Beings who flew without wings, who lifted mountains with their hands, who carried within them a violence that felt refreshingly unfamiliar. A slow smile spread across his face. At last, he thought, a new world, a new field of battle, a new list of names to break. The first Global Defense Agency strike team descended into the crater with heavy weapons and containment protocols. They shouted command. They fired warning shot. They demanded surrender in 3 languages. Kaido regarded them the way a mountain regards a rainstorm. Within minutes, the crater fell silent again, littered with broken armor and unconscious soldiers, none of them killed, all of them thoroughly humbled. By dawn, every news network on Earth carried the same footage. An unknown giant had fallen from a torn sky, and he did not seem interested in conquest. He seemed interested in something far more dangerous. He seemed interested in fun. The world spent the next day trying to name what had arrived. Analysts argued on television. Governments argued behind closed doors. Some called him an alien. Some called him a god. Some quietly whispered that they had seen this pattern before, and that whenever a being of this scale appeared, cities did not survive the answer. The guardians of the globe were mobilized before the sun rose again. They were the shield that stood between humanity and the impossible, and this new arrival had already broken every scale they used to measure threats. They found him waiting on the coast of a ruined island, seated calmly on the shattered remains of a lighthouse, drinking from a massive gourd as though the tsunamis he had caused were somebody else's problem. When the guardians descended around him, they did so in disciplined formation. Rex Splode readied his charges. Duplicate spread across the beach. Black Samson braced for impact. Immortal spoke first, voice steady, offering the intruder a chance to identify himself and stand down. Kaido looked at them, and Kaido laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was not mocking. It was the honest, delighted laugh of a warrior who had been lonely for far too long and had finally found something worth his time. He rose slowly, the ground creaking beneath his weight, and welcomed them the only way he knew how. He invited them to attack. They did. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a lesson delivered by a teacher who had grown tired of pretending otherwise. Rex's explosives detonated against Kaido's chest and left only smoke. Black Samson's strongest blow bounced off his jaw with a dull, almost embarrassed sound. Immortal, a warrior who had fought through centuries, struck him with the full weight of his ancient strength, and Kaido merely turned his head, as though a strong wind had touched his cheek. Around them the shoreline shattered. Sand turned to glass. The ocean itself flinched from the shock waves rolling off the fight. Yet Kaido did not kill. Not one of them. Every strike he returned was measured deliberate, designed to bruise pride rather than end lives. He wanted them to stand up again. He wanted them to keep coming. Their defeat was not the point. Their persistence was. Then Mark Grayson arrived. He landed between the Guardians and the giant with his cape torn from flight. Blood already on his knuckles from a fight he had rushed away from to get here. He raised his hands, not in threat, but in plea. He asked Kaido to stop. He offered to talk. He tried, with the sincerity that only a young hero still believing in words could manage, to end the fight without another building falling. Kaido went very still. He studied the boy in front of him with an expression the Guardians had not seen before. It was not amusement. It was recognition. He had seen this shape 1,000 times across 1,000 seas. A young warrior standing at the edge of something enormous inside himself, terrified of the size of his own shadow. Kaido had crushed many such warriors. He had also raised a few. And the difference between the two paths, he knew, was almost always a single conversation. He did not kill Mark. He struck him instead. Hard enough to send him skipping across the water like a stone. Then he waited, arms folded, until Mark rose again, coughing, furious, alive. Kaido smiled and told him to try harder. Told him to stop apologizing for existing. Told him that weakness, real weakness, was not a matter of strength, but a matter of hesitation. For Kaido, a weak opponent was a disappointment. A hesitant one was an insult. But potential, raw, trembling, unrealized potential was the most entertaining thing in any world. And in this quiet, frightened young man with sky in his eyes and thunder in his fists, Kaido saw enough potential to justify the entire trip. News of the giant traveled quickly, but not all ears received it the same way. In the quiet office of a respected author, behind curtains drawn against a city that still trusted him, Nolan Grayson watched the footage in silence. His wife did not know. His son did not know. But Omni-Man knew exactly what he was looking at. He had walked across 1,000 worlds in service to the Viltrum Empire, and in every one of them he had learned to recognize a single kind of creature. The kind that did not belong to any nation, any species, any leash. The kind that would eventually have to be removed, because empires cannot tolerate variables they cannot predict. He set down his coffee. He rose from his chair. He did not tell anyone where he was going. Kaido was standing on a mountaintop when Omni-Man arrived, watching the sunset with the calm of a man who had once ruled entire oceans. He felt the visitor before he saw him. A pressure in the air, a weight in the wind. A presence that did not politely announce itself, but simply pressed itself against the world until the world made room. Kaido turned slowly and grinned. Omni-Man did not speak. He did not need to. He crossed the distance between them in a blur that would have shattered a normal opponent before the first breath. His fist arrived at Kaido's face with the force of a colliding planet. Kaido caught it. The mountain beneath them exploded. For the next several minutes, the sky itself became a battlefield. Omni-Man moved with the practiced speed of a warrior who had ended civilizations in a single afternoon. Every strike was aimed to kill. Every angle was chosen from centuries of experience. He drove Kaido through cloud layers, hammered him into the stratosphere, then dragged him back down through the atmosphere like a comet that had chosen the wrong world. Any other opponent would have shattered a dozen times over. Kaido laughed the entire way. He answered with blows of his own, blows that carried the weight of a lifetime of ruling the seas, blows that did not need speed because they carried inevitability. His club moved like a mountain deciding to lean. His fists arrived with the rhythm of tides. When he finally shifted, when the bones and muscles of that towering body twisted into the enormous serpentine dragon of legend, Omni-Man actually paused in the sky, eyes narrowing at the impossible shape coiling through the clouds in front of him. He had seen many aliens. He had never seen a dragon. The battle expanded outward. Forests flattened for miles in every direction. Rivers changed course from the shock waves alone. Satellites in low orbit registered the impacts as seismic events. Coastal cities felt tremors from a fight taking place hundreds of miles away. Omni-Man's speed carved lightning across the sky. Kaido's Barreau breath melted stone into rivers of glowing red. Neither of them yielded. Neither of them slowed. Neither of them, in truth, was fighting at full strength. They were measuring. When the two of them finally landed across a crater that had, an hour earlier, in a valley, they were both breathing heavily. Omni-Man's uniform was torn. Blood ran from a split at his temple. Kaido's chest bore a burn that would have leveled any lesser being. And yet, as they stared at each other across that ruined ground, something unexpected passed between them. Not friendship, not even truce. Something older and stranger than either of those things. The quiet recognition of two apex predators discovering for the first time in a very long time that they were not alone at the top of the food chain. Omni-Man wiped the blood from his face and almost smiled. Kaido rested his club against his shoulder and definitely did. Neither of them said the word rematch. Neither of them had to. Far above them, hidden in the cold vacuum of deep space, a Viltrumite scout ship recorded everything. The footage was encrypted, packaged, and fired across the stars toward Viltrum Prime. Within days, the highest chambers of the Empire were watching a warrior none of them recognized trade blows with one of their finest and walk away from the exchange grinning. The Empire had spent centuries convincing itself that no unknown power could match its bloodline. Now, on a small planet at the edge of a minor system, an unknown power was doing exactly that. The Empire, for the first time in a very long while, felt something almost like concern. And where the Empire felt concern, the Empire always sent soldiers. The order came down without ceremony. Viltrum did not deliberate over threats. It processed them. A single directive, encoded in the ancient command tongue of the Empire, dispatched an elite strike unit of Viltrumite warriors toward the strange blue world. Their instructions were simple. Locate the anomaly. Test its limits. If it proved inconvenient, remove it. If it proved useful, break it into obedience. The Empire had performed this ritual on 1,000 worlds. It had never once failed to complete the task. They descended over the Pacific like falling stars. 6 of them. Each one strong enough to end a continent on their own. Each one wearing the confident expression of a soldier who had never met an opponent worth remembering. They expected another earthbound champion, a proud fool with a costume and a slogan, another line item to be crossed off a very long list. They found Kaido waiting for them on a coastline that had already been remade by his previous battles. He had felt them coming for hours. The Empire soldiers carried a particular flavor of pride, a certain sharpness in the air, and Kaido had learned long ago how to taste such things from a great distance. When they landed in a loose formation around him, he did not raise his club. He did not shift. He simply looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces the way a collector memorizes the labels on rare bottles, and asked them, almost politely, which of them wished to be broken first. They attacked as one. What followed was not a battle. It was an unveiling. Kaido had been holding himself back on this new world, testing its warriors gently, refusing to spoil the surprise. Now, with 6 trained killers of the Viltrum Empire pressing him from every angle, he finally allowed the ceiling to lift. His body twisted upward, expanded, unfurled. Scales spread across his skin in shining plates. His limbs lengthened into serpentine coils. His shadow crawled across the coastline until entire towns were swallowed by darkness. The great azure dragon of the eastern seas rose over the Pacific, and the sky itself seemed to lean back to make room. The first Barrow breath crossed the horizon in a single line of white light. 2 Viltrumite soldiers barely evaded it. The third did not. The beam continued unbothered for miles, boiling a section of the ocean into steam, glassing an uninhabited island into a mirror. When Kaido inhaled again, the Empire's warriors, for the first time in their long, arrogant lives, understood what fear tasted like on their own tongues. Then Kaido released his conqueror's haki. It did not roar. It did not flash. It simply pressed, an invisible weight, an ancient will, an unspoken command that reality itself seemed to obey. Two of the Viltrumite soldiers dropped from the sky, unconscious before they knew what had touched them. The remaining three staggered, teeth clenched, eyes wide, feeling for the first time the presence of a will older and heavier than the empire that had raised them. From a nearby ridge, Grayson watched, silent, unable to look away. He had grown up believing that strength was a tool, something you carried carefully, something that existed to protect the people who could not protect themselves. He had never imagined strength as a language, a philosophy, an argument shouted across a battlefield. Yet here was Kaido, this impossible creature from an impossible world, teaching that lesson to the most feared empire in the galaxy without saying a single word about domination. He was not trying to conquer this planet. He was not trying to conquer these soldiers. He simply wanted to know sincerely whether any of them were worth the fight. The difference struck Mark harder than any punch he had ever taken. Viltrum killed to rule. Kaido fought to live. And somewhere between those two truths, Mark realized, was a question he had never truly asked himself. What was his own strength actually for? He did not have an answer yet. But for the first time, he understood that the question mattered more than the fists. The Empire did not retreat quietly. It never had. When its first strike team failed to return, more soldiers came. Then more. Then entire warships. Within weeks, Earth found itself living under a sky that flickered with distant explosions. A sky in which every sunset carried the possibility that it might be the last. Governments that had spent decades mistrusting one another suddenly found themselves reading the same reports, listening to the same warnings, sharing the same unbearable understanding. The war they had all been quietly preparing for had arrived, and it had not waited for anyone to be ready. Alliances formed in strange rooms. Old enemies sat across old tables. Cecil Stedman spent his nights making phone calls he had sworn he would never make. Villains who had once terrorized entire cities were offered pardons in exchange for standing on the correct side of the line. The Guardians of the Globe fought alongside people they had personally arrested only months earlier. And through it all, at the center of every strategic map, at the top of every briefing, was one name that no analyst could categorize. He fought beside humanity, but he did not fight for humanity. He made no speeches. He signed no treaties. He did not care about the flags waving over the cities he defended, and he did not pretend otherwise. When Cecil tried to thank him for his help, Kaido looked at the small human with genuine confusion, then laughed, then walked away. He was not a soldier. He was not a hero. He was a warrior who had discovered that this new world's greatest enemy was also this new world's greatest source of worthy opponents, and he had no intention of leaving the buffet before he had tasted every dish. Mark stayed close to him whenever he could, partly because Cecil had asked him to, partly because he wanted to. In the quiet hours between battles, when the smoke was still rising from the horizon and the wounded were still being carried away, the two of them sat on rooftops and cliff edges and broken bridges, and they talked. Or rather, Mark talked, and Kaido listened, and then Kaido spoke, and Mark tried very hard not to argue immediately. Mark believed that strength existed to protect. He said it with the certainty of someone who had watched too many people die for lack of a protector. He talked about his mother. He talked about the neighborhoods he flew over every night. He talked about the small, ordinary lives that would end the moment the Empire finished its work. Strength, he insisted, was a promise. A promise made by the strong to the weak that the world would not simply belong to whoever hit hardest. Kaido listened, and then Kaido shook his head, not cruelly, almost gently. He told Mark that promises were fine, but promises did not stop tsunamis. He told him that the weak did not need protectors. They needed to become strong or accept the consequences of remaining weak. Strength, he said, was not a shield. Strength was a throne. It existed to dominate, because the world itself was already trying to dominate everything within it, and only strength could answer strength on equal terms. To pretend otherwise was to lie to children. They argued in circles. Neither convinced the other, neither expected to. Yet something quiet was happening in both of them. Mark began to notice how often his idea of protection required someone stronger than the threat, and how rarely the world provided that convenient arrangement. Kaido began to notice how often this young warrior chose to shield strangers he would never meet, and how that choice, absurd as it was, seemed to make him fight harder rather than softer. Neither of them said it out loud. Neither of them would have known how. But in the pauses between their conversations, a strange respect was growing, root by root, beneath a battlefield that grew larger every day. Above them, the Viltrum Empire tightened its grip on the outer defenses of the solar system. Warships gathered at the edges of the sky like a rising tide. Everyone on Earth knew what was coming. Everyone on Earth knew that the small victories they had won so far had only been the opening notes of a much longer song. The real battle had not yet begun, and somewhere in the quiet of his own chest, even Kaido was beginning to smile at the thought of it. The invasion did not begin with a warning. It began with the sky turning wrong. On a morning that should have belonged to any other day, the clouds above Earth were pushed aside by a wall of Viltrumite warships descending in perfect formation, blotting out the sun across 3 continents at once. Sirens rose in cities that had never known sirens. Children were pulled from classrooms. Old soldiers picked up rifles they had promised themselves they would never carry again. The war that everyone had been preparing for had chosen its hour, and its hour was now. The Empire came down in waves. Thousands of trained Viltrumite warriors poured through the atmosphere, each one strong enough to level a city on their own, each one raised on the belief that this world was theirs by right of superior blood. They spread across the surface like a rising storm, expecting the resistance to break within hours. They had done this before. They knew the pattern. They knew the pace at which hope collapsed in the hearts of a defending population. They had not accounted for Kaido. He stood at the center of the invasion, arms wide, laughing at the sky. Mark and Omni-Man landed on either side of him, an impossible trio no story had ever imagined. A father and son and a monster from another world, all facing the same enemy for entirely different reasons. Behind them, the Guardians of the Globe held the line. Behind the Guardians, a coalition of every hero and every reluctant villain Earth had ever produced braced for the collision. And when the first wave of Viltrumite warriors reached them, the world shook so hard that satellites lost their orbits. Kaido shifted. The great dragon rose again, larger than any warship, coiling through the burning sky like a living thunderstorm. His burrow breath carved trenches across the invasion fleet, cutting warships in half, scattering formations into chaos. His conquerors' haki rolled across the battlefield in waves, and the weakest of the Empire's soldiers simply fell out of the sky, unconscious before they could understand what had touched them. Omni-Man moved through the enemy ranks like a red comet, faster than any of them expected, striking with the practiced precision of a warrior who had once served the Empire and now knew exactly where each of its soldiers was weakest. Mark fought harder than he had ever fought in his life, harder than he had believed he could, because he was fighting beside 2 beings whose respect he had learned, without meaning to want. The battle stretched across a full day and into the night. Cities burned. Oceans boiled. Mountains cracked open along fault lines that had been quiet for millions of years. The Viltrum Empire kept sending soldiers, and Kaido kept meeting them, and every time another wave descended, his laugh grew louder rather than weaker. He was bleeding. He was burned. His scales were cracked in a dozen places. He did not care. He had waited his entire life for a battle like this, and no wound in any universe was going to convince him to leave early. At one point, surrounded on every side, with Mark on one flank and Omni-Man on the other, Kaido looked up at the endless enemy pouring from the sky and simply grinned. He told them, in a voice that carried across the battlefield, that all of this, was the greatest gift any world had ever given him. He did not thank Earth. He did not thank humanity. He thanked the Empire, sincerely, for being strong enough to be worth fighting. Then he raised his club and he charged again. The Viltrumites had come expecting a conquest. What they found instead was a storm shaped like a dragon, a father and son fighting side by side against everything he had once served, and a battlefield ruled by a warrior who did not fear death because death, to him, was simply the price of the only meal that had ever truly satisfied him. By the time the last Viltrumite warship broke formation and fled into the dark between the stars, Earth was almost unrecognizable. Coastlines had been redrawn. Cities lay in careful ruins. The sky, which had burned for so long that people had almost forgotten its true color, finally cleared into a quiet, exhausted blue. Somewhere in the silence that followed, a child laughed for the first time in weeks, and the sound carried further than any explosion of the war before it. The invasion was over. Earth had survived. And at the center of a battlefield larger than any single story could hold, a wounded giant sat down on a hill, rested his club across his knees, and looked up at a sky that was already beginning to tear open again. Mark found him there. Neither of them spoke at first. There was too much between them, and not enough words in any language to carry it. Kaido was bleeding from a dozen places that would have killed any other creature. Mark was bruised in ways he would feel for months. Around them, the world was quietly beginning the long, patient work of rebuilding. And above them, a familiar dimensional storm was gathering, colors swirling in patterns that Kaido recognized like an old friend at a distant door. He was going home, or somewhere close enough to it. Before he rose, he looked at Mark for a long moment, and then he offered him the only farewell he had ever known how to give. He told him simply that strength without purpose became empty, and purpose without strength could not survive. He said it the way an old sailor might describe the sea to a young one, not as advice, as fact. Two truths that most warriors spent their entire lives trying to balance, offered freely to a young man who might yet have the years to try. Mark did not answer right away. He thought about his mother. He thought about the cities behind him. He thought about the father standing somewhere in the distance, still not entirely forgiven, still not entirely lost. He thought about every promise he had made and every promise he had failed to keep. And he realized, slowly, that even someone as ruthless as Kaido, someone who had spent his entire existence chasing battles for their own sake, had arrived at a kind of wisdom that most heroes never reached. A wisdom paid for in scars. He nodded. He did not say thank you. Kaido would have laughed at that. He simply met the giant's eyes and let the silence between them carry what words could not. Then Kaido stood. He walked slowly into the light of the widening storm. He did not look back. He did not wave. He simply stepped through the tear in the sky as though returning to a road he had wandered from, and the storm closed behind him with a soft, final sound. In the years that followed, the story spread further than anyone expected. It crossed languages. It crossed borders. It crossed, eventually, the boundaries of worlds. In distant systems, in cantinas and command bridges and quiet libraries, travelers began to speak in low voices of a creature who had once fallen from a torn sky and fought an empire simply because the empire had promised the greatest battle imaginable. Some called him a monster. Some called him a legend. Some quietly called him a teacher. Some legends are remembered for what they protected. Others are remembered for what they proved. And in a universe that had spent so long measuring strength by the size of the throne it could build, one wandering giant had proven something older, and stranger, and far more difficult to forget. That true strength, when it laughs loud enough, can shake the stars themselves.